Let's talk about consequences, the kind that come back to bite, even when you think you're in control. In the world of global trade, every action has a ripple effect, and sometimes those ripples turn into waves that crash back on your own shores. When Trump slapped tariffs on global trade, he imagined a revival of American industry. The vision was factories roaring back to life, jobs returning, and a new era of American-made pride. What he didn't expect? Canada, quietly finding new buyers for its grain, turning a challenge into an opportunity almost overnight. Instead of boosting American business, the tariffs pushed our northern neighbor to innovate and reroute trade. Canadian exporters got creative, finding new routes and partners and investing in smarter logistics. The plan was simple: make foreign goods pricier so Americans buy local, but in reality, it's never that straightforward. Prices went up, but so did confusion and frustration for both businesses and shoppers. But trade isn't monopoly, it's a web, and yanking one thread unravels the whole thing. Every country is connected, and a single move can set off a chain reaction that's impossible to predict. Canada, forced to adapt, found eager new partners in Europe. No drama, just business. European markets welcomed Canadian grain, filling the gap left by American tariffs. The result? American farmers, the supposed beneficiaries, are losing out as Canadian grain heads overseas. Instead of more sales, they're left with surplus and uncertainty. It's a self-inflicted wound. The tariffs meant to help have only made Canadian logistics smarter and American markets weaker. The unintended consequences are now impossible to ignore. The grand plan to make America great again has, ironically, made Canadian trade more innovative. Canada's export industry is thriving, while American farmers are left waiting for relief. Sometimes, building walls just gives your neighbor a reason to find a better door. In the end, trade finds a way, and so do those determined to keep moving forward. Trump's tariff blitz was meant to level the playing field and protect American jobs. The administration promised a revival of American manufacturing, a return to the glory days when "Made in the USA" meant prosperity for workers and communities across the country. The idea was simple: make imports expensive, so Americans buy domestic. The hope was that higher prices on foreign goods would push consumers and businesses to choose American products, boosting local industries and creating new jobs. But the world isn't that simple. Global trade is a web of connections, with supply chains stretching across continents and economies relying on each other in ways that can't be untangled overnight. Tariffs on steel and aluminum led to retaliatory tariffs on U.S. agriculture, hurting the very farmers they were meant to help. Suddenly, American crops faced new barriers abroad, and farmers saw their markets shrink almost overnight. Trade is a two-way street. Every action has a reaction, and every tariff invites a counter-tariff. When the U.S. hit Canada, Canada hit back, targeting American farm goods. Long-standing trading partners suddenly became rivals, and trust began to erode. The policy ignored how deeply intertwined our economies are. Decades of cooperation and shared infrastructure were put at risk. Canadian grain often moved through U.S. ports, creating jobs here. These cross-border flows supported entire communities and industries. Instead, the sledgehammer approach shattered decades of cooperation. Relationships built over generations were suddenly in jeopardy. The result? America's agricultural trade balance slipped into deficit for the first time in nearly 60 years, ballooning to $21 billion by 2023. Farmers who once exported around the world now struggled to find buyers. Countries like Canada simply found new partners, redirecting their exports to Europe and Asia, and building new relationships that bypassed the U.S. entirely. U.S. farmers were left with surplus crops and shrinking markets, forced to watch as their competitors filled the gap. The dream of American dominance ended up encouraging our neighbors to build their own friendlier hills. New infrastructure and alliances sprang up, making it even harder for the U.S. to regain lost ground. The fatal flaw? Oversimplifying a complex system and expecting the world to play along. Instead, we isolated ourselves, and the consequences rippled through every corner of the economy. And as the world adapted, it moved on, leaving American farmers and businesses to pick up the pieces. Canada, tired of trade uncertainty, got creative. Instead of relying on U.S. routes, they revived the port of Churchill in Manitoba, a deep-water Arctic port with a direct line to Europe. This move bypasses U.S. tariffs and political risk, offering Canadian exporters a faster, safer route to global markets. The Churchill port is now a national priority, signaling a permanent shift in Canada's trade strategy. For decades, goods flowed north-south. Trump's tariffs forced Canada to look east. The Churchill Gambit is a bold bet: invest in new infrastructure, secure new partners, and reduce dependence on the US-Canadian farmers now have a competitive edge, reaching Europe directly. The message to Washington is clear: Canada is charting its own course. Sometimes the best way out is through the Arctic. The numbers don't lie. Canadian grain exports have shifted dramatically. Where once grain flowed south to the US, now it sails east to Europe. Industry data shows a surge in direct shipments from Canadian ports to European destinations, while US handlers report sharp declines. European buyers, seeking stability, are choosing Canadian wheat over American, avoiding the political drama. For Canadian farmers, the choice is obvious: sell to a welcoming Europe or risk US tariffs and uncertainty. Every ton of grain that leaves Churchill for Rotterdam is lost business for American workers and processors. The US agricultural trade deficit, already at $21 billion, is only getting worse. America isn't just losing sales, it's losing its role as the continent's trade hub. The Great Grain Migration is a quiet indictment of a policy that alienated allies and empowered competitors. The numbers tell a story of lost opportunity, and the world is listening. America's loss is Europe's and Canada's gain. For American farmers, the trade war feels like friendly fire, damage coming not from a distant enemy, but from policies at home. Tariffs meant as protection have become a cage, especially for those in border states who once thrived on cross-border grain flows. Now, those same borders feel like barriers, cutting off lifelines that sustained rural communities for generations. Business models built on Canadian grain have collapsed as that grain now heads to Europe. American elevators sit idle while ports up north bustle with new activity. The irony? Policies meant to help have left silos empty and revenue down. Instead of prosperity, many farmers are left with uncertainty and anxiety about the future. Retaliatory tariffs from Canada and others have further hurt US exports, while American farmers face stiffer competition from South America and the EU. New trade routes are forming, and US grain is being left behind. The US agricultural trade balance has been negative since 2019, and market share is slipping in key destinations. Once a dominant force, American agriculture is now struggling to keep pace. The diversion of Canadian grain weakens America's position as the central hub of North American trade. The ripple effects are felt far beyond the farm gate, impacting local economies and supply chains. Instead of a renaissance, many farmers face financial strain and lost relationships. The stress is visible in every overdue bill and every tough conversation at the kitchen table. They're the casualties of a trade war they never wanted, bearing the brunt of decisions made far from their fields. The grand strategy to protect American farmers has left them more exposed than ever, with some even forced to consider selling land that's been in the family for generations. The promises of protectionism have rung hollow in America's heartland, where empty storefronts and fading flags tell the real story. The real winners? Canada and Europe, who have seized new opportunities and expanded their markets at America's expense. The real losers? The very people the policy was meant to protect, hard-working American farmers left to pick up the pieces. While American farmers struggle, Europe is thriving. European markets now enjoy a steady supply of Canadian grain, free from US political drama. This stability lets European buyers secure long-term contracts, boosting their own food security. Canada, once the junior partner, is now a formidable player, negotiating with both the US and EU from a position of strength. The Churchill port and new trade routes have redrawn the global map, making Canada less dependent on the US. America's attempt to wall itself off has pushed its neighbors closer together. Europe's gain is America's self-inflicted loss. This isn't just about wheat, it's about shifting power and influence. While America built fences, Canada and Europe built bridges. The toothpaste is out of the tube. North American trade has changed for good. Canada's investments and new partnerships are here to stay, even if US policy shifts. The trust that once defined US-Canada trade has eroded, replaced by new routes and contracts. Protectionism in a globalized world is a losing game. Trade relationships need trust and predictability. Chaos drives partners away. The US took its central role for granted and made itself dispensable. The future? A more fragmented, competitive trade environment. America faces a long road to rebuild credibility and influence. Canada and Europe are planning for a future with less US dependence. The America First policy has, ironically, put American farmers last. The Great Grain Diversion is a cautionary tale about the cost of breaking trust. The 49th parallel is now a symbol of a changed relationship, and that, for American farmers, is a bitter harvest.